Okay, so let's take some responses. Someone, please tell us about what you talked about related to your project and some strategies that maybe you can implement moving forward. I know we had a short amount of time, but please, anyone want to start us off? Yes.
Oh boy, great. I forgot we're recording this. So our project is to infuse music into programming assignments,
Okay.
and using world music examples that will then target different cultures and sort of connect them to the programming assignments.
Okay.
And that's kind of related to a couple things. It's number one, I think the biggest thing is sort of trying to reframe the task and embed it into a context, and you're actually encouraging people to consider the programming assignments in the context of generating rhythms or whatever it is. And so I'm aware of an experiment where they basically had a math word problem.
Okay.
And if they called it a math problem versus a verbal word problem, they got a big difference in outcomes, and that's that reframing the task. And so you change those programming assignments to not be about learning programming, but about generating a rhythm, about expressing your cultural identity through your musical programming assignment. And so it's also about self-affirmation. You'd have to make sure those assignments include specific ways to make them express their culture through the assignment.
Yeah.
And it's not just their culture's not on the side of the assignment.
Right.
The culture's in the middle, and the programming learning is on the side.
See, okay, this is a great example, and one of the things I heard out of that is language, right? So in reframing the task, what kinds of language do I use that can better resonate with the students, that make them feel more connected to the task, engaged in the task resonates with them, right? So the language that you use in reframing is a simple kind of implementation step that I heard here that others can take. Thank you so much. Someone else, a different project. No one else? You all were having such good conversation. Please.
Alex and I here are doing interactive fiction, and Alex is the computer programmer. And what they're going to do is create text-based computer games where they have to write scenes, settings, characters, but it's interactive in that they have to make, when they encounter certain situations, they have to make decisions.
Okay.
So when it's framed, when it's framed, they can choose their own character, they can choose their own story.
Okay.
Usually when you give those kinds of story prompts, students choose characters that reflect, often, not always, but often reflect themselves. And we're thinking at the end of the class, what we'd like to do is have students play each other's games. So everyone will take on the different identities.
Right. So I really like that, because that's about reframing the task, encouraging self-affirmation, and it's also increasing the students' cultural competency, right, by the playing of other games and experiencing the ways in which others constructed theirs. That's great. Yes, please.
I was actually a participant in their conversation, and a piece they didn't mention I find fascinating. They're using a narrative, creative avenue that might be more appealing to women than men to get people programming, which tends to be more appealing to men than women. And they made the comment that by sort of, making it challenging for everyone, for either the beginning or the end, has sort of equalized that. And I just find that fascinating when thinking about de-emphasizing a threatened social identity.
Yeah. How do you reframe the task to actually be more well suited for the group that's traditionally marginalized, right? I mean, that's great as well. So it seems like you all are thinking about ways, and perhaps maybe already implementing some ways to reduce stereotype threat, eliminate it hopefully, but at least reduce some of the negative effects. Okay? Good. Let's move on to critical race theory, which is it's really a theory that helps us inform the implications of racism in teaching and learning. And so, you know, it's my understanding that at least people wanted to understand what this is in case they come across it, and how is it applicable to your work as an educator. So critical race theory came out of the law, actually, critical legal studies. And then education adapted it in about the mid-90s, and now we have critical race theory in education. And the theory really focuses on the examination and transformation of the relationship between race, racism, and power. It really places many of the same issues of conventional civil rights struggle in the U.S. in a broader perspective that looks at economics, history, context, group, and self-interest. But it really is undergirded in how we understand racism, not just as acts at the individual level, but systemic racism. And so I would ask you all to think about, you know, particularly as we talk about underrepresented ethnic minorities, how might systemic racism be at play in your unit, in your discipline, maybe manifesting out of your project work and you don't even know it. But thinking about, you know, what are those racist ideologies, practices, behaviors, language that might be operating unintentionally, okay? Let me skip past that and get to the tenets. The tenets of critical race theory. First of all, the theory supposes that racism is endemic. It's endemic to U.S. society. It's permanent. It's not going to go away. That's very pessimistic, but the theory presupposes that, and that we're always working to eradicate racism in the U.S. It also supposes that everyone has potentially conflicting, overlapping identities. Right? So this is that whole idea of anti-essentialism. We can't say all white folks do X, right? Or all women are Y, right? That's too essentialistic. CRT says we have to counter that kind of generalizing about people if we're ever going to eradicate racism. It also says we have to raise up the unique voices of people of color, and that it should be affirmed and counted as a valid source of knowledge. I think it was John, we were talking in the break, and it's not just how you come to learn what you know, but is it seen as valid? Like, is your way of understanding valid? And for many non-white groups in the U.S., their way of, their cultural understandings aren't deemed as valid. And so CRT counters that, and it has a social justice focus. While race is the root, CRT is also very concerned with intersectional identities. So not just the experiences of, you know, Latinos in, you know, classrooms, but perhaps Latinas, right? Hispanic women. How do we look at race and gender? Or how might we look at the intersection of race, class, and gender? And how layering those multiple identities affects somebody's learning experience, okay? There are 4 kind of critical questions that CRT scholars ask. And I consider myself to be, you know, one of these CRT emerging scholars. One is how do racism, sexism, classism, and other forms of subordination shape institutions of learning? How do educational structures, practices, and discourses, what we're saying, actually maintain the discrimination? Okay? Thirdly, how do students and faculty of color respond to and resist the subordination? And then fourthly, how can education become a tool to help end these kinds of oppressive structures? So now I'm going to be quiet and ask you to do something again, right? CRT can be very abstract, but it provides us a way of having a racial analysis on things that are happening in our teaching and learning. Does that make sense? So instead of looking at those question 1 and 2 in that way, I want you to kind of take those and think about how might structures, practices, and discourses in your TIDES project actually be maintaining some of these discriminations, right? And how can you work against that? It could be race, class, or gender, because remember, while CRT is concerned first with racism, it looks at that intersection with other identities. So again, take some moments. Is the task clear? To now talk again about how structures, practices, and discourses might be at play in your project that are maintaining some of this bias and how you can work against that. Okay, please proceed. Try to be as honest with yourself and your colleagues as possible. Okay, if you can try to wrap up what you're talking about. I know we're a little short in our discussion areas, but I'd love to get some comments from some different universities and colleges. So let's try to come back together. And if we can have a different project group that hasn't spoken, share with us what you talked about during this segment, that would be great. Who would like to share with us? A group that hasn't spoken yet. They are having a theoretical, no, it's okay, debate over here. A group that hasn't spoken, please. Anyone want to share with us? Would love to get at least 1 or 2. Oh, please, yes.
It's related to a little bit like what we talked about. I did some work on the image processing subfield of computer science, and it's that field is for until just recently, even today, it's common in image processing classes to work with images taken from Playboy magazine, for instance. So that's a pretty extreme example of gender bias in computer science, and that was started. It's been for like 15 years now. Or maybe more, maybe 20 years, and it was very difficult. Some people tried to change it. It was very difficult. There was resistance to change that. So I actually like to actually continue to work with those images scanned from Playboy. So how to correct for that? I wouldn't say start working with images scanned from Playboy. Too wrong doesn't make right, but we can use like more like less, I would say less offensive images, because I actually find it offensive to work with those sort of data. I mean, there's nothing special, really nothing special in this data. And then somebody probably thought it was funny, but I don't know. I
So
disagree.
this kind of extreme exploitation, marginalization, and oppression of women through those images. I would say when you layer race, ethnicity onto that, what we often see in images, media images, especially for women of color, particularly Black women, notice this. I think it's gotten a little bit better, but oftentimes there's the imaging around, leopard print or cheetah print, this kind of subliminal messaging of, like exotic, beastliness, right, for women of color that you don't see for white women in imaging. And so this would be an example where CRT would layer on the race piece, but also look at the intersectional piece around race and gender exploitation and oppression. Someone else? Another project group, please.
So it was just an observation that you were talking about layering. That we find very few institutions that have in leadership positions. So talk about provost deans who have a combination. So Latino women STEM. So throw in STEM. So throw in the STEM in there and then try to find another intersection. Will you find a STEM Latino, STEM person of color? Very few institutions to point that out. Although all institutions do want students, right? They want to attract, but when they don't want to have, the mirror on the other side doesn't look the same.
That's right. Yeah. No, it's a great example, right? How is it that we actually, what kind of messages do those send around invalidation when we don't see people with multiple marginalized identities in those places of leadership, decision making in our field, etc. And so how might the work you're doing in your projects help to encourage that, even though those examples aren't already in the institution? But how might your work help encourage that? Good. All right, so we'll move along because I want to get to some other pieces, but there was also a request to think about microaggressions. How many of you are familiar with the term microaggressions? Okay, so some are, not as many as I would have thought. So microaggressions are these subtle insults that are verbal, nonverbal, and visual that are usually directed towards people of color, often automatically and unconsciously.
Are you sure you know this?
That I know that's what a microaggression is? Oh, that was a microaggression right there. This is a good example. No, this is good. This is good. Did y'all see my face? Like, what? I'm about to kick him up out of here. No, right, so that was a microaggression. So racial microaggressions are, Chester Pierce. Anybody in psychology might know Chet Pierce, right? He's actually the coiner of this term, and then other scholars have used it. And he said, one must not look for the gross and obvious. It's the subtle, cumulative mini assaults on people's identities. An example that I still get from time to time, but you're so articulate. That's a microaggression. What was your expectation, right? That I wouldn't be? And for me, I don't know, are you saying that because I'm a woman or I'm black or a black woman? Like, what's underneath? You're so articulate, That's a microaggression. So that's an example. The person doesn't mean harm, but there's a lot up under that, right? They're these subtle, stunning, often automatic, and nonverbal exchanges. When Chet Pierce is an African-American male, when he was doing the work in the 70s, he really focused it on African-Americans. In and of itself, the microaggression seems harmless. Like someone saying to me, you're so articulate, they actually don't even think that's insulting, right? It's harmless. But the cumulative burden of just continuing to hear that is an assault on my identity. And so I want you to think about how either A, you've experienced racial, gender, or some other kind of microaggression, or how some of your students might have experienced these and how you might have, accidentally been the perpetrator of the microaggression. There was a hand, yes.
Yeah, I'm curious about how the thing we were saying before, women do good in this test, like using positive stereotype. is similar to you are so articulate. You know, they are, they share a little bit of things in common, you know. So using a positive stereotype is implying in some way that you are not so supposed to do very good in this test.
Interesting. That is interesting. I think it can be utilized that way. But again, it's about the root of what you say, right? So if in fact, when someone said, women, you know, women do well at this task, if the root of that is actually that is the case, women do it, that is not the same. A microaggression typically has a negative assumption behind it. Does that make sense? So the fact that someone would say, you're so articulate, there's an unconscious assumption, this is the rationale behind, that you would not be.
Yeah, but no.
Am I understanding what you, maybe?
Yeah,
I'm
but the
not.
problem is that nobody says men do well in this test.
No,
So
yes.
if this is true, it means that there is this subtle expectation for women to not do so well.
Right.
So that's a little bit
That's a microaggression.
problematic, you know.
Okay, so he's right in that way. And there's such a thing as so stereotype threat is actually an example of environmental microaggressions, right? So what he's talking about is this kind of, you know, atmospheric racism or sexism, that it's not stated, but it's out there. And in some cases, I would call that a macroaggression. If it's environmental, it's really at the macro level. Thank you for saying that. So here are some examples. You know, some of these happen in the workplace to women in underrepresented fields, or just in fields, and you know, must be that time of the month, or you know, you're so bitchy. You know, I mean, this kind of, wow, you're really good at this, right? Well, what was the expectation, that I wouldn't be good? Right? These are things that are, and then you wonder, like, did they just say that because, you know, I'm, you know, a woman, I'm a person of color, I'm young, I'm, you know, whatever. Oh, was there a question, comment?
Well, I don't think that one down there that says, wow, you're really good at this, I don't think that's an insult. I don't think saying that implies that I didn't expect you to be good. Because I quite often will say to students, that's great, that's good, very good.
No.
I don't
Yep.
mean that I didn't expect them.
That's right. No, this is good that you said this. So these things are very context specific, right? I'm glad she said that, because I don't want people to not praise students because you're thinking, oh my gosh, this is a microaggression. No, it's very different when you're praising students for strong effort, good work ethic. That's very different. So it's about the context, and it's also about, which is out of our control, how the learner is perceiving it. Perceptions are people's reality. And so her comment is actually very powerful. Even when we mean well, we can't control how the person on the other end perceives or receives the information. So I'm just trying to bring to your awareness, and at the same time tell you, don't stop praising students, but be conscious that if you're saying some of these things to students of marginalized groups, you just have no control over how sometimes they might be perceived given the context, right? That's all. But that's out of our control in some ways, okay? But certainly, please continue to praise for effort, and in most cases, students are not saying, I can't believe she just insulted me, you know, for telling me I did well at this. It's about that context. There are a couple hands. Oh, please, here, and then
Well,
we'll go.
so I'm at Howard University,
Okay?
and the example that you had of "You're so articulate," is really sort of an in-joke at Howard. In fact, it's more likely that one of my black colleagues, will make some remark to me and say, "Oh, you're so articulate," just turning it around.
That's right.
And so you would often hear that around, but again, it's sort of an in-joke to reflect on the knowledge that this is aggressive.
That's right.
When as Joe Biden said about Obama back in 2008.
That's right. No,
Yeah,
that's right.
He said exactly that.
Please, thank you. Yes.
It's me. Okay. So I wanted to something that occurred to me when you were talking is the flip side of this, which is the perception side, right? And there also has to, I think, be, in some ways, reaching out to marginalized groups to also control, or not control, but to think about how they're perceiving things that are said to them too. And so it just kind of remind me there's two sides to that. And that misperceptions between what people say and what they mean happen all the time.
Yep.
And that it's not necessarily microaggressions, it's also just people don't always understand what people are saying the way the person intended it. And it happens
Exactly.
every minute.
No,
And
that's
so
right.
that's something else to kind of factor in, especially if if you have students that are particularly sensitive, well, then you adjust to that. Or, if there's ways to reach out to the students and try
That's
to open
right.
their minds up
Yep.
a little bit, then that would make it easier for them
Yes.
to resist those kinds of thoughts about themselves too.
I mean, it's a slippery slope. Sometimes individuals are hyper aware of a particular identity, right? But I think we have to be careful about assuming or naming their response as hyper aware. Well, you're too sensitive about gender, or you're too sensitive about race. Well, that's not your call to make. And in fact, the more we communicate and understand each other, then perhaps the recipient is less likely to feel insulted, and the perpetrator is more conscious of what they say or how they say it. But it is a slippery slope in terms of naming people as hyper aware of a certain identity versus, let's talk this through and come to some understanding. One more.
One of the microaggressions that I see, and I don't know where this would go, micro, this whole idea of dismissal. So it's very common for African-American faculty or students to be in an environment where they would say something and it gets dismissed, and then another person in a majority, primarily a white male, says the exact same thing, and it becomes the best thing since pockets. So there's some kind of like, what did I just say that didn't get heard? I mean, women know this particularly. This happens a lot in a gender context, where you say the same, verbatim, and then they say the next thing, and it's like, oh, Bob, that was great. Let's go with that idea. And I'm like, what?
Yes. This is
What
a
is
great
that
point.
called? Is that
You must read my work, because a lot of my research has been about this, and teachers, facilitators, instructors are least aware that this is happening, especially when you put students in groups, right? The marginalized student is in the group with the majority students, and like literally the majority students are talking to each other. It's as if that student is not there. And the teacher is so unaware of this, but the marginalized student is just experiencing this dynamic. And those majority students I don't know that they always recognize, like they're literally looking at each other. They never look at the marginalized student, and whether it's a woman or a person of color. And my research, the participants say this. I'll say something, people are, and then he says it, oh, that was a fabulous idea. So it's this invalidation of the person's whole being. So I do want you to be conscious of this when you pair students together, when they're in small groups. It happens to me. I know my colleagues don't mean it, but just in faculty meetings, right, where I might be the only person of color, like they're literally having the dialogue and not even looking at me. But because I know what this stuff is, I just, insert myself into the conversation. So it's your privilege. It's your male privilege that leads you to act this way. It's your race privilege. It's you know your language privilege when people discredit English language learners. It's the area in which you are dominant where you make these mistakes. And so the work around microaggressions is to help us be cognizant of that. Daryl Wing Sue is another, I think, clinical psychologist who does a lot of work in this area. And because of time, I'm not gonna go through the other slides, but I'll put these 2 books on the reference list: Microaggressions in Everyday Life, Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation. And then his colleague, Kevin Nadel, who has written with him a long time, put out a book around microaggressions and the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, right? But the experience of these, I'll just let you know about the types: micro assaults, micro invalidations, and micro insults. You know, so Sue gives them all these various names. My next slide has, we talked about they can be verbal, nonverbal, and environmental. So the climate can, you know, be one where there are assaults, okay? Some examples here of the micro assault, you know, just using the wrong language, colored or oriental or any kind of term that's derogatory, discouraging interracial interactions. The micro insults look various ways. If we talk about in the classroom, oftentimes it will manifest itself as the instructor not calling on marginalized students, and often you don't realize it. I do observations in classrooms all the time, and then I'll debrief with the teachers. Did you realize you didn't call on a single male for the entire class period? Oh, what? I didn't, you know. People, you know, you're unconscious about, that's about that implicit bias, right? And oftentimes students will say their hand was up and the instructor still didn't call on them. What's underneath that? Okay, here's that piece around avoiding direct eye contact, really rendering your peers invisible. Okay. And then the micro invalidation. Here's one when, you know, especially for international students, the idea of, you know, oh, you speak such good English, you know. I mean, again, that's such a insult. Or I don't see color. You know, we're all human beings, right? I mean, people say this, they don't understand it's a invalidation because, yes, we're part of the human species, not race, because human is not a race. Race is socially constructed, right? We're part of the human species, but we're unique individuals with very rich cultural histories. So if we say, oh, I just see students, well, then you're not recognizing their differences. So it's actually, that's color blindness and culture blindness. All right, so we'll skip forward, but I want you to think about, we don't have time to do this because I want to get to a couple of the other inclusive strategies, but I want you to think about how you might have been the perpetrator of microaggressions and what you can do to combat this in the future through the project work that you're doing, okay? How you might make some different decisions or steps that avoid these kinds of insults, assaults, and invalidations from occurring. So we're going to turn to a couple of frameworks for inclusive teaching. You all know the definition. I don't have to read that, but I want to use our last bit of time to talk through a couple and give you a few minutes to think about them. I believe this is the golden sheet in your folder where I have actually put the core tenets of each of these. And so while we're not going to have time today for you to really work through what these might look like in your project and in your classroom work, you've got the tenets there, okay? What I think is interesting for you to look at is across these 4 inclusive teaching frameworks that help us become more culturally competent, you'll see similarities. I mean, we're researchers, right? People love to coin and theorize things that actually have been theorized before, and now we just give it a new name. And so across these 4, you see some similarities. These frameworks come out of the discipline of education. And so, wow, how innovative, huh? Yes, education. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole, you know, it might be quite innovative for you to bring some of these frameworks to your own field, right? These theoretical frameworks in your writing and as you write additional research proposals. So one is Geneva Gay's framework that she calls culturally responsive teaching. And she argues this as a way to be more culturally competent, right? That you use students' cultural knowledge, prior experiences, their performance styles. I heard that about the project in the back, to teach to and through the strengths of students. She gives these kind of tenets of that kind of teaching. It's validating, it's affirming, it's comprehensive and multidimensional. It empowers students. So as you think about your project work, how is it actually empowering to the learner, right? What are the ways in which you've designed it that they feel empowered as a result of engaging in the project? And how is it transformative? Okay? And emancipatory. Gloria Ladson-Billings calls it culturally relevant teaching. So we can be relevant and responsive, right? Those are linked but a little different. And she says that culturally relevant educators make sure every student experiences academic success in the learning environment. Now that's going to look different for each student, but every student should have an experience with success, and in doing so, they maintain their cultural identity. That they don't have to reject that to be successful, and that you actually help them develop cross-cultural skills. And then thirdly, that they develop a broader socio-political consciousness. So this maps back to critical race theory's focus on social justice. So Ladson-Billings says, as culturally competent people, we actually focus on getting our students to question the status quo. How does what we're teaching and the projects and assignments we design actually move them towards questioning inequality? So that's a different take as well. And then Christine Sleater talks about critical multicultural teaching, right? How is it multicultural? Because it affirms all those different identities. How is it critical? She's like Ladson-Billings in that it helps students learn to read injustice in their own world and then become change agents. And then she brings in the responsive piece by saying it connects with and builds on their identities. You can hear the overlap in these theoretical frameworks, and you can see what are those core tenets around being culturally competent educators? Now, I'm breezing through these, but are there ways in which you can think about how those help you think about some aspects of your project work? Anybody have a comment or reflection as you look at your golden handout or what's on the screen? Okay. James Banks talks about these 5 dimensions of multicultural education and multicultural teaching. And in being culturally competent, you'd be working towards these. I'll send you a resource that allows you to look at those more in depth. I'll actually provide these set of slides for you so that you have them, so that you can go back and look at that to map on to your work. So I want to make you aware of some of those pieces that he looks at there. And again, just to wrap this up by talking about inclusive teaching practices, I'm sure some of you are familiar with these centers. In Australia, the Center for Teaching at Vanderbilt, and then at the University of Washington. I mean, there are centers in universities where they are discussing and giving strategies for inclusive teaching practices. I'll make this one available to you as well. And I would just ask that you think about how can you utilize these strategies to map into your work, in your TIDES project and your work moving forward, right? Being available and approachable to guide student learning. We talked about that early on. I talked about making expectations clear, right? Use accessible language. That's sometimes about reframing the task. Over here at University of Washington, and I remember someone over here mentioned this earlier, communicate respect, fairness, and high expectations for everyone, right? Not just for some students, for everyone. Look at down there on University of Washington, foster equitable classroom participation. You know, how do you kind of keep those dominant speakers at bay and create space for students who don't speak so often to actually engage? Everyone's not a large group talker, so how do you create more small group or pair and share exercises that allow different voices to be illuminated? So this is in your, I knew we wouldn't get to this, but I put this nice handout as the last one in your sheet because I have to give you homework. I'm a teacher, that's what I do. And so, you know, whether you use the sheet or not, you can use another piece of paper because the boxes are small. But as you leave at some point in the very near future, I want you and your project mates to think about, you know, how do we move from this increased awareness to action, right? Particularly around James Banks's 5 dimensions. What will we do in the next month or 2? And how are we going to measure that we're effective at something different that we tried, right? And then what are our long-term goals? I want you to do it as a project group, but I also want you to do it at the individual level. Find an accountability partner that you can share your plan with, somebody who's going to hold you to, look, you said in the next month or 2, these were some different ways in which you were going to practice being culturally competent, more culturally competent. Okay? So I want you to commit to that. And if you even feel like emailing me about some things you tried, I'd love to hear about that. And so as we close out, I do want to acknowledge there are barriers to being culturally inclusive, right? Things for you to think about, what might impact your ability to implement culturally relevant and responsive instructional practices. And this is key. Maybe you want to do it, but the organization doesn't support it. How do you work around an environment that doesn't support cultural inclusivity? That can be very challenging when you want to do the right thing, but the system is not doing the right thing. And so as we close, I'll ask you to take an index card, and I don't want you to answer all of these, but this is my way of getting a better understanding of how I've done today. Tell me what stuck. Maybe you had an aha moment. Maybe you had a pleasant surprise or something you struggled to understand. Or maybe there was something you agreed with really strongly or you thought was particularly interesting. Maybe there was something you didn't expect that happened in this 3 hours. Or you got an insight or a solution. Or there's something you want to know more about. Just take a few moments as we close and write something, a couple things on a clean index card, and you can leave that on the table for me. It has been my pleasure. There's always never enough time to talk about issues of equity and cultural competence, but I hope that you're walking away with some new insights, and please feel free to contact me in the future. Thank you for having me.